This video is meant to show you how to start the colorwork section of the tiger sweater. The colorwork chart features color coding to represent the 6 different yarn colors and symbols to represent each strand of yarn of a particular color. A group of cells on the colorwork chart that are the same color and symbol mean those corresponding stitches are knit or purled with the same strand of yarn. I am knitting with the black and white tiger kit, so both my main color and my contrast color 1 are the same colorway. I'm knitting a size 2, so I'll be following along chart 1 in this video. However, all 3 charts begin the same, they just have a different number of stitches between each color change. I've already knit the first few sections of the pattern and I'm ready to start the colorwork. You can see I have these 2 back panels. Between the teal and plastic stitch markers is the stitches for the right shoulder. And then the front of the sweater is between the teal and orange plastic stitch markers. But it also has these 2 metal stitch markers that are going to mark the border of the colorwork chart. For the first few rows, I'm going to move these metal stitch markers every knit row as we increase stitches, and then once we get to the full width of the colorwork chart, we'll keep the metal stitch markers where they are. I'm going to pop a sliver of the colorwork chart at the top of the screen so you can follow along with it and see what stitches I'm doing. Since I'm knitting with the same colorway for contrast color 1, which is brown on the chart, and the main color, which is gray on the chart, the entire first row is going to be in that black colorway. But I'm going to treat it as if I'm using 2 separate colors to show you how the knitting would look. I'm knitting the first 5 stitches of this row as indicated on the chart, and now my next stitch is a new color, new symbol, and it has a thick black border around it. This means I need to start a new strand. I've pre-cut one just a bit longer than my wingspan, and I'll join it as I normally would joining a new yarn to any knit project. Every time you add a new strand of yarn, you'll use something about 1 to 2 wingspans long. When you get further along in the colorwork section and you have more than 20 strands of yarn hanging from your project, it will be easy to pull each strand through as you need, instead of spending time detangling bobbins. This method is used, of course, with the exception of the main color strands, because you'll be knitting all of the stitches in the row on either side of the tiger and you'll go through the yarn more quickly. I would just use 50-gram balls of yarn for each side. So now I'm knitting with the new strand I just attached as the chart says, and then I'll need to join another new strand of the main color and continue knitting with that. When you reach the end of a strand and need to join new yarn, I recommend using the invisible knot method I've linked in a video to in the description. This may seem time consuming at first, but I promise that after the first several rows you'll get into a rhythm and joining new strands won't be a pain. I'll also note here that when you reach a stitch in the chart that has a red symbol, that denotes the last stitch of that strand and you can cut it off, leaving a 6-inch tail for weaving in later. If you find that your strands are starting to tangle and they're too long for you to just pull them through and they end up knotting, opt for shorter strands each time you join. So maybe do just 1 wingspan or a little bit less. So far we have done 2 color switches, but in both of those examples we were working with new strands of yarn. In the next row, the purl row, we will encounter a color switch with 2 pre-existing strands of yarn, which means we will have to do an Intarsia switch. If you don't have any experience with Intarsia, I would recommend at least watching a couple other intro videos on it, and I'll link some below in the description. It's pretty easy to pick up because you don't have to worry about tensioning your yarn in a specific amount like you do with stranded or ferrule knitting. Every time you do a color switch in this project with 2 existing strands of yarn, you will want to do an Intarsia switch, meaning you will move the working yarn to the left side and the next color to work on the right side, then knit or purl. Once you knit or purl, you can move the yarn hanging on the left side back to the right side. I'll show you this in a minute when we get back around to the purl row. In the next row, we will also have to float a strand of yarn. This is what you do in stranded knitting, and hopefully you will have some experience with that. The purpose of Intarsia switches are to secure the stitches that are otherwise not connected, so you don't end up with holes in your work. The purpose of floating yarn is to reduce the number of individual strands you need to achieve the tiger look. However, a side effect of floating yarn is that it also secures your work. So when you are carrying a float and you need to do a color switch, technically you do not have to Intarsia switch first. I don't want to confuse you by this or spend too much time thinking about it and explaining it, because I do find it easiest to just do an Intarsia switch every time I switch colors. My hands get into a rhythm of doing this, and it means that I don't have to think about whether or not I need to do an Intarsia switch. Let me fast forward this video so we can get purling and you can see what I mean in action. Now I'm on the purl side and I'm just about to start the second row of the colorwork chart. I'm going to fast forward again because for now I only have color changes on the other side of this row, so you'd just be watching me do lots of purl stitches. You can see that we currently have 3 total live strands. One concern you may have is that it could be difficult to quickly figure out which existing strand to pick up when you're ready for a color change. I actually found this to be an issue much less than I would have expected when designing the chart. You don't need to label your strands or anything like that. Just as a rule of thumb, pick up the closest strand that matches the color you need. If there are multiple strands of yarn of that color nearby, then you can reference the pattern to be sure. There's a PDF option showing the chart upside down to make this easier. However, if you make a mistake and start knitting with the wrong strand, that is completely recoverable. You don't need to unravel anything, simply use the strand you were supposed to grab for the sections requiring the one you did use. Worst case, you can always add another strand and continue the chart as normal. This process does become very intuitive as you keep going, so give yourself time to follow the learning curve. We are ready for a color change, so now we will do an Intarsia switch. As I explained before, take the working yarn and move it to the left side of your work. I'm doing this in front because we are purling. When you move the working yarn to the left side, place it over the yarn you are about to pick up. You want these 2 strands to lock. You can hold the old working yarn using your thumb and then pick up the new color strand and purl. Once you have that purl stitch, which is the first stitch using the new color, you can move the old strand back over to the right side. Moving the old yarn back isn't essential to securing the gap between the stitches, but it is helpful for keeping everything neat and detangled. Now I'll continue purling the 2 stitches in this strand, and the following stitch will require a new strand completely, again denoted by the thick black border around the stitch on the chart. This means I don't have to worry about doing any Intarsia switches. I'm using a medium gray as my contrast color too, so this will take place of the orange. You've already seen me add a new strand, but now on the purl side. I'll continue to purl with this gray strand for 3 total stitches, and then I will float the black strand I just dropped, since the brown symbols before the orange are the same as the brown symbols after the orange. As I mentioned before, anytime we do a color change, you should do an Intarsia switch, which just means moving the working yarn over to the left-hand side in front of any next strand we want to use. But this is an example where that isn't necessary. As you can see, the next strand I want to use is to the right of my working yarn, behind it on the row. I'm still going to pull the working yarn to the left and secure it with my thumb because it's easier to keep the same hand motions with each color change, but it's not necessary this time. When I float the yarn, this secures the work. I'll purl the next few stitches doing one more Intarsia switch between my contrast color 1 and my main color, which happen to both be black. I'll take this opportunity to say if you make a mistake in the color work, meaning you use the wrong color in a few stitches, you probably don't need to go back and fix it. The nature of this tiger image allows for some misplaced colors, and it would be near impossible to knit every one perfectly. It is probably only worth tinking back if you are using the wrong colors around the eyes, ears, and mouth, since those are the most distinctive features. I'm going to fast forward the knitting again and then show you one more row of the colorwork chart so you can see how I hold the yarn during Intarsia switches on the knit side. Don't forget to follow the written pattern as you do the colorwork chart. In this case, it calls for increases on each side of the Raglan markers on every knit row still. Speaking of, the pattern also says to move the stitch markers at the border of the colorwork chart out one on each knit row for a few rows, and I forgot to do that, so I'll fix that now. When knitting on the right side of the work versus purling on the wrong side of the work, Intarsia switches are almost exactly the same. You just need to move the working yarn to the left side in the back now instead of the front. Instead of holding the yarn with my thumb, I use my index finger. This is purely optional, but when I hold the yarn I just moved to the left side during an Intarsia switch, I hold it as if I was going to knit continental. This is nice because if I need to start carrying floats and switching back and forth between two strands, I can use both continental knitting and my regular throwing method. I'm not great at continental knitting though, so it's kind of just up to which hand is more tired that determines if I will do this. If you don't knit continental, you can still do the project just fine. Again, just like with the purl side, you can move the old strand back to the right side if you want. I'll do another Intarsia switch here to start using the gray strand. I think here in the video I was just trying to show that you can either move the old strand back over to the right side or you can keep it as is. It's kind of why I'm fumbling around with the different strands and moving them back and forth. But this is just a regular Intarsia switch here. Here I need to cut and attach a new strand because we are starting a new symbol for contrast color 1. And the final color change for this row is one last Intarsia switch. When I recorded this video, I wanted to be sure to get shots where I slowly used one of the techniques, then undid and redid the stitch so you could clearly see how I did it. Unfortunately, I think I did that for every example of an Intarsia switch in this video. So I hope you can see that it truly is simply overlapping the working yarn with the next strand to be used. Be sure to check out the linked videos in the description if you need more clarification specifically on Intarsia. I hope this video was helpful and either gave you some clear instruction for approaching the colorwork chart or gave you an idea of the techniques used in the pattern to help you decide whether or not it's for you. It certainly is a tougher, more intricate project, but watching the tiger image unfold as you knit is worth it.